Welcome to the National Press Foundation. We're coming to you from the Evelyn Y. Davis Studios. I'm Chris Adams, Director of Training for NPF. Today we're talking about CBAMs, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanisms, or carbon border taxes. There are proposals to implement them in the EU and the US, a prospect that could antagonize companies at home and trading partners abroad, as well as create diplomatic challenges at the upcoming climate conference in Glasgow, Scotland. We'll learn what they are, how they work, and whether they are likely to go into effect anytime soon. I'll introduce our guest panelist in a minute. But first, we're thankful for our sponsor, the Heinrich Foundation, an Asia-based philanthropic organization that works to advance sustainable global trade. We're here today to talk about carbon border taxes, what they are, how they work, whether they'll make it through daunting political and diplomatic challenges. Our guests today are Candido Garcia Molyneux, an attorney with Covington and Burling, based in Brussels. Haran Onder, a senior economist at the World Bank, based in Washington. And Paula Tama, a reporter for Politico Europe. She's also based in Brussels. We'll hear from each of the panelists, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. You can raise your Zoom hand or put a question into the Q&A text function. And please tweet today at hashtag #NPFCarbonBorder. Welcome all. So Candido, Paula, and Haran, thank you very much for taking the time to come talk with us. We basically have this divided into three segments. Candido is going to give an overview of carbon border adjustment mechanisms. Haran is going to talk about what the special impact of them on developing nations is. And Paula will talk a bit about how to cover these from a reporter's perspective, as well as give a sense of the politics of them in the EU. So Candido, I'd like to turn it over to you first. And Candido has a slideshow, and he is going to present. Each of the speakers will talk for 8 to 10 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for questions. So Candido, I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, good morning, or good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to make a short presentation about the European Commission's proposal for a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is probably one of the most developed proposals in this area. And perhaps it will help to define future regimes in other countries. Next slide, please. Now, from an EU perspective, and here I have to make clear I'm not representing in any way the European Commission's view, but of course I see things as an European from an EU perspective. The carbon border adjustment mechanism, or the proposal that the European Commission has presented, has a much broader context, and that context is the European Green Deal, an enormous package of environmental initiatives that was presented in December 2019, and it's being implemented in 2020, 2021, and so on. The European Green Deal is the flagship, the political flagship of the current European Commission. Now, with this Green Deal, there is what we call the Fit for 55 package, which is a package that focuses on climate change measures. And the first requirement that it imposes this package is to require the EU and to put a legally binding target to reduce emissions by 55% by 2030 and to achieve neutrality by 2050. And this is an enormous ambition, but at the same time, it's a legally binding requirement. So the EU institutions are required to ensure that when they adopt measures, they comply with these targets, or at least they don't adopt measures that go against these targets. To achieve these targets, in addition, this Fit for 55 package also requires industries that are subject to the EU emissions trading scheme. It's a market of emissions allowance in the EU, and it's basically all industries, medium, large size manufacturing plants in Europe, to reduce their emissions. They are required to reduce their emissions by 61% by 2030. And in addition, the package also requires the EU to reduce or to increase its use of renewable energies to up to 40% by 2030. Now, obviously, all these requirements are extremely ambitious and entail an enormous cost for the European economy as a whole, but also for individual companies. Next slide, please. And this is where comes the concept of carbon leakage that has been discussed already for several years in the EU. The idea of carbon leakage is that because the EU imposes requirements on companies to reduce their emissions, on companies manufacturing the EU to reduce their emissions, these companies may be tempted to move to other jurisdictions which do not impose similar requirements. And the argument goes on in that this results in that the European Union loses a competitive advantage, but at the same time, it renders meaningless the climate change efforts that the European Union is doing, because if companies just go abroad in order not to comply with the requirements, at the end of the day, climate change is a global issue. So whatever the EU does and the obligations that are imposed on EU companies have no impact whatsoever. Now, the CBAM is mainly, or one of the main objectives of CBAM is to address this carbon leakage. And at the same time, the CBAM is also intended to encourage other jurisdictions to adopt measures that are more or less equivalent to those of the EU in terms of reducing emissions, in terms of mitigating climate change. So if one looks in detail at the Commission's proposal for the CBAM, you will see that it has a sort of a balance of carrots and sticks, okay? Incentives for countries to create similar schemes, emissions trading schemes, or climate change mitigation measures, and at the same time, levies for imports from countries that do not apply adopt such measures. It is obvious also that the CBAM is the proposed CBAM in the EU is also, of course, intended to influence the international discussions on climate change that are going on, and in particular in the context of COP26. Now, before I go on, I do want to make clear that at least for the time being, there's a clear signal that the EU is going to go ahead with this proposal. Next slide, please. Now, very, very quickly, how does the scheme would work, okay? The scheme is not really, from our perspective, it's not really a tax. It's more a sort of obligation for importers of covered goods to buy certificates, the price of which is equivalent to the price of the ETS allowance in the EU ETS market. Now, the CBAM would work in 4 steps. First of all, only registered importers that are called authorized declarants, so only certain entities that get registered will be able to import the covered goods. In order to be able to import steel or aluminum that is covered, you would have to be registered. Those entities over the year, a calendar year, would be importing the covered goods and monitoring the volume of the covered goods and the embedded emissions that are in those covered goods. And those entities, those authorized declarants, would have to purchase a certain amount of CBAM certificates that will reflect or will intend to cover the embedded emissions in the imported goods. And I think it's every May of each year, those authorized declarants would have to make a declaration saying, this is the amount of goods that are imported in the prior year. These are the embedded emissions that were in all those goods. And these are my CBAM certificates to cover those embedded emissions. Next slide. Now, the EU is, in terms of scope, it's being rather limited. and it's perhaps this is a bit of a pilot project for the time being. It's covering those goods that are considered to be at high risk of carbon leakage, or at least some of those goods, which are steel and iron, aluminium, cement, certain fertilizers, and in addition, electricity. So it's not all goods, it's only those categories of goods. And in fact, it has to be goods that fall under certain tariff classifications. And in terms of covered countries, what is important to keep in mind is that it would basically cover all non-EU countries, except essentially the EEA countries and Switzerland. And that, so for example, it could cover the UK, okay, goods coming from the United Kingdom, but the European Commission would be entitled to exclude countries if they have an emissions trading scheme that is fully integrated into that of the EU, or if their trading scheme is linked to that of the EU. For example, for many years, there have been discussions on how to link the California trading scheme with the EU scheme. Next slide. One of the, I'm not going to go into details, and maybe we can go in during the question time, but one of the key issues of this proposal is how do you calculate the embedded emissions? And that's not only the very, very basic principles are in the proposal. That's going to be defined later on by the Commission through implementing regulations. But of course, one important issue is whether what happens with complex goods, what type of, is it scope 1 or scope 2 or scope 3 emissions, direct, indirect emissions. And also very important is how do you verify that a good in a third country has been manufactured and has generated so many emissions. And of course, here will also be important default values when you can't calculate it, and the possibility to establish in default values depending on the country. For example, take into account the circumstances of developing countries. Next slide. Just to make clear that the price of the certificates, each certificate would be basically, so would be equivalent to 1 ton of emissions, okay? So, and the price of the certificates, would try to reflect the weekly average price of the allowance under the EU emissions trading scheme, the emissions allowance that companies in the EU have to buy to comply with the ETS. Now, however, under the CBAM, there would be no market. So importers, operators would not be able to trade with the certificates. They could only buy the certificates and at the end of the year surrender the certificates, and some of them could be canceled if they wish. Next slide, and final one. A very important issue of the proposal is discounts and adjustments. And one is the discounts for carbon price. The idea that the amount of certificates that importers would have to buy could be reduced if the importer can show that the product has been manufactured in a country of origin, in a third country, where there's already a carbon price being paid. But that carbon price can only take the form of a climate change tax or of a cap and trade scheme. For example, if a third country decides to adopt other types of measures, such as encouraging companies to adopt technology to reduce their emissions, or other schemes that are not exactly a tax or emissions trading scheme, that in principle would not be taken into account in order to get a discount. And also very, very polemic from the EU perspective is the adjustments for the free allowances that the EU would continue to give to its domestic industry. As long as the EU domestic industry continues to get free allowances, and certain sectors are getting free allowances, the idea is that importers would also get an adjustment in order so that there is no competitive advantage. Now, just to finalize, the European Commission has put a lot of effort in trying to ensure that there's no, at least from a former point of view, there's no discrimination between between how it treats the domestic industry and how it would treat imported goods. And with this, I'll leave it on for the next speakers. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll go on to Haran in just 1 second. I do want to ask one very specific question. You listed the 5 sectors that are going to be part of this initially: steel and iron, aluminum, fertilizers, electricity, and a 5th one. I'm wondering what would be the number 6 industry on that list? I mean, who is likely to be next? Which industry is likely to be the next one to be wrapped into this? Or is there a big drop off between those 5 and other industries?
I think basically at risk are all those that are now considered to be suffering from carbon leakage in the EU. For example, one sector could be chemicals. That's a huge. Also, the story might be a bit more complicated because, in principle, this only covers, the raw steel, aluminum, but there is the risk, in order to prevent circumvention, that it could also later on cover products that are made of these materials. And that's something that could come into discussion. I mean, that would really change the scope, but one has to be aware that, and even if they're not formally covered, there will be serious implications. There will be serious implications for all types of goods that are made of these materials. For example, the electronics industry or the vehicle industry, even if formally they're not covered, there will be, from the supply chain point of view and the price point of view, the CBAM will have a very significant impact. Okay,
thank you. So now let's turn it over to Haran Onder, who is a senior economist at the World Bank, based in Washington. I've asked him to come talk about the special considerations for developing nations and what they think of these, and how the system might take into account their concerns. So let me turn it over to Haran, and look forward to your talk.
Thanks, Chris. Let me share my screen as well. So I will talk about on the economic side of the problem to a certain extent. And the question I'm going to try to answer is, how will the carbon border taxes affect the developing nations? I'll just spill the beans and give you the short answer. If we divide this impact into 2 pieces, for example, what will be the impact on the economic output in developing economies, for example, the GDP of the developing countries, and then what will be the impact on the greenhouse gas emissions in developing countries. So when we split it this way, we expect that the carbon border taxes will reduce the economic output in developing countries, undoubtedly. Whereas its impact on emissions in developing countries will depend. In some countries, it will reduce the emissions, and in other countries, we expect a possibility that it might actually increase the emissions. And to explain that, let's use a simple example here. Just assume that we have 2 countries in the world. One is an advanced economy, the other one is a developing nation. The developing nation is on the left-hand side, the advanced economy is on the right-hand side. The horizontal axis here shows the emissions in these countries, and then the vertical axis shows in a way, effectiveness of producing an output by using those emissions. And the closer you are to the 0 level for the developing country, for example, you are more effective in producing something valuable out of an emission. And if you keep emitting more and more, that effectiveness decreases. You can consider this as if like some firms are more effective in producing more and emitting less, whereas other firms are less effective, so they produce less but emit more. So we rank them this way. So what happens is that for the developing country, this triangle, the orange triangle, is the economic value of its GDP, its output. And we have only one product in this case. Whereas the emission is the horizontal axis. So in this case, when the carbon price is zero, which means that both the advanced economy and the developing economy, they don't charge anything for carbon. What happens is that both economies produce until the marginal value of the product is equal to the carbon price, in this case, zero. So as long as they can produce an economic value, they will keep emitting. So this is the beginning conditions. And what happens when the advanced economy introduces a carbon price, and then the developing country adopts that as well? For example, in Candido's presentation, he mentioned that one of the motivations behind this carbon border taxes is to increase the compliance in other nations as well. So by introducing the carbon taxes, you incentivize them to introduce the same carbon tax. So let's see what happens when they introduce the same carbon tax. What happens is that they keep producing until the marginal value of their product is equal to carbon price, in this case, the horizontal P1 star line. And as you see, the orange triangle shrinks. So the economic output in the developing country shrinks, but its emissions also decrease. From zero, initially it was at E0, between the 0 and E0 line, and now it's 0 and E1 line. So both the emissions decreased in the developing country and its output has decreased. But how about if the developing country does not introduce the same carbon price? What would happen? In that case, the developing countries' exports will be subjected to this carbon border tax at the advanced economies border. And what happens is that with that tax, the terms of trade of the developing country will deteriorate. In simple terms, the developing country will sell its good for a cheaper price now, because the tax at the border makes it more expensive for the advanced country consumers. And as a response, the developing country exporters will adjust their prices down. So for the same production, they will be paid less. So that also increases and so decreases the output, as you can see. And also it decreases the emissions as well. Now it's going to be between 0 and E2. So which option will the developing country choose? Will it adopt the same carbon price, or will it say, okay, we will pay the tax at the border, we are not adopting the carbon price? So it's difficult to say which one is preferred ex ante without knowing more details about the developing country. Some countries will choose the carbon price, implementing the same carbon price, whereas other countries will choose just to pay the fine, but don't implement the carbon price domestically. Especially those countries who are dependent on the advanced country markets. For example, you're producing a good, you're exporting it to European Union, but you cannot sell it elsewhere, really. You don't have any alternative, you have to sell it there. Then in that case, the price effect, the impact on your export prices might be higher. And you might find implementing the carbon price more preferred compared to getting fined at the border. That was only for one sector. So if we are only talking about one sector, then those are the impacts. The output will shrink and the emissions will shrink as well, but how much exactly will shrink depends on whether you choose the carbon price or you prefer to pay the fine at the border. How about if we have multiple sectors? So there are more interesting things happening for the developing country. Like in this example, I'm using a simple kind of numerical way. Initially, the developing country is producing 9 outputs. 3 of them are dirty and 6 of them are clean. So when the developing country does not implement the same carbon price and it's just fined at the border of the advanced country, what happens is that, first of all, it reduces the trade, it reduces the exports of the developing country. So that is something we call a scale effect. And holding everything else constant, that scale effect is proportional in terms of the dirty and clean sectors. So both the clean sectors and the dirty sectors decrease by a third. So the new output of the developing country is 6, 2 of them dirty, 4 of them clean. But then there's something more interesting in this case. So we have 2 sectors here, right? One is clean, one is dirty. If the developing country is exporting its clean good to the advanced economy, for example, let's say agriculture may be relatively cleaner compared to other sectors. When it's exporting the clean good to the advanced economy, and the moment it faces this carbon border tax, the price of the clean good will decrease relative to the price of the dirty good. So what happens is that inside the developing country, more resources will be allocated to produce the dirty good rather than the clean good. So that facing that carbon border tax at the advanced economy border makes the developing countries shift from cleaner sectors to dirtier sectors if the developing country was exporting its relatively cleaner good. So that is what we call a composition effect. So overall, although the total output does not change, we see that we have 4 dirty outputs in this case and 2 clean outputs in this case. So that shows that actually the emissions in the developing country could increase if it was exporting relatively cleaner good and now facing a carbon border tax at the advanced country border. And there is a third channel, which is also important. Remember that trade facilitates technology transfer between nations. As the advanced economies innovate in terms of the more emission efficient machinery and other technologies, and they trade with the developing countries, that technology is over time transferred to the developing country. And this is important. But what happens is that when the carbon border tax reduces the amount of trade between the developing country and the advanced economy, that transfer slows down. So the developing country will not have as much access to cleaner technologies. So although maybe the dirty goods would shrink to 3 because of that technology effect, now it will stay as 4. So in the end, the output impact of the carbon border tax is negative. That is given in single sector or multiple sectors for the developing economy. But the emission effect will depend on the developing country characteristics. If the developing country was exporting the relatively cleaner goods, the composition effect might be strong. And together, the composition effect and technique effect might dominate the scale effect and increase the emissions in developing country. So in a nutshell, it will depend on country-specific characteristics. And we can come back to this point in a bit more detail during the Q&A. Let me stop here.
Okay, thank you very much, Orhan. Yeah, we'll come back. So I have some questions for you on that. We'll come back and listeners, if you have questions, you can raise your Zoom hand and we'll work those questions into the Q&A. You can also put a note into chat and we can call on people that way. But I want to turn it over to Paula Tama, a reporter based in Brussels for Politico Europe. And Paula, I was hoping you could talk to us about how you write stories about the carbon border tax or the carbon border adjustment mechanism. How do you write stories like that take this complicated issue and make it understandable for your audience? You've been writing about it in the EU more than American reporters have been writing about it. So, since you've been through it longer, I think it could be helpful for readers or our journalists here to understand that. And I was also just hoping you could talk to us a little bit about the politics of whether this is going to go through, what kind of prospects this faces in the EU. So let me turn it over to Paula.
Of course. Thanks for having me. Yes, I think that the EU's drive to implement the carbon border adjustment mechanism, or CBAM, is the first time that anybody attempts this, so that's why there is such a huge amount of interest for it. And it's a policy with potential endless ramifications, as we just heard, also in terms of economics impact, legal retaliation, and so on. So there is a wealth of stories in there. I've started covering in 2019 when the European Commission, so the executive arm of the EU, put it in its program to implement a CBAM, and I followed every step of the way. I will go later into a little detail about how does the EU work, where we're at, and the chances of it being adopted. But I think that to be able to write about this proposal, one needs to understand why is the EU doing it, or the US doing it, or Japan doing it, and so on. And for that, I'll bring you just quickly back. And I think that it's good to use images for policies because they're so complex. And one way I think about the CBAM is a loaded gun image, because so far, and in my experience of covering climate negotiations, these are good efforts, good multilateral efforts to put on the table commitments and follow through with them in order to reduce emissions. But for the first time, we now have somebody, a party, the EU, and potentially more, coming to the table with, the nuclear option in their pocket. And I agree with Candido when he said that this could potentially have an impact on multilateral negotiations and generally on trade. The EU is doing it for two reasons. So the CBAM is both a good cop and bad cop scenario vis-a-vis the domestic audience, so the domestic EU industry and producers. CBAM is a carrot because what we have heard from Candido on the Fit for 55 package and the Green Deal, these are all fancy names for the EU's vision to drive down emissions to net zero by 2050. And it's doing it because it wants to stick to the Paris Agreement, but also because it believes that this is the developmental strategic goal that a large advanced economy should give itself in order to thrive in the future. Why? Because the EU has, let's say, lost the digital race. The US is ahead on that, but in some sectors, in one specific sector, which is green tech, the EU has an edge. And so it decided that that's the road that we're going down for the next decades. And we're going to decarbonize our economies and try to beat the rest of the world to get the technology fast and produce the best technology possible so that we can then sell it. This is the kind of strategic goal that one has to keep in mind on why is the EU going carbon neutral. And the CBAM in this kind of proposition is the carrot part of the deal, because the EU has come through this July with a huge partly controversial package with huge amount of regulation, over 12 bills and laws, which are aimed at decarbonizing the economy, including the CBAM. So the other represent a cost for EU industry, whereas the CBAM represent a reassurance that under certain select sectors, EU producers, while they're striving to produce climate neutral steel and clean fertilizers and all of that, they will not face competition from cheap, dirty imports from abroad. So vis-a-vis the domestic industry, it's a message of trying not to kill its industry while it decarbonizes. And then there is the other face of CBAM, which we have touched upon, which is the message to the international audience, which is saying basically, well, we all signed up to the Paris Climate Agreement some 6 years ago, and now it would be nice if you followed through with it, with some actual action. And if you don't, well, we're going to put a price on accessing our market. And let's remember that the EU's internal market is the largest asset in negotiations for it, because it is the largest market on earth in terms of number of consumers. So please do more in your climate policy, meaning put a price on emissions, do what you need to ensure that you do your part under the Paris Agreement, and then the CBAM will hit you less, because as Candido explained, what the EU is trying to do with the design of the scheme is not to put a price on every import of steel, but it's to put a price based on the carbon content on every single producer. So the price that a importer has to pay when it buys a ton of steel from, say, Australia, constructed with CCS, carbon capture and storage technology, and so with a much lesser carbon content, will be less than a ton of steel bought from, I don't know, India, made with coal. So it's an incentive to decarbonize because then your price, the price that you will have to pay under CBAM will be less. So we've kind of nailed why it's doing it vis-a-vis its domestic industry and also the rest of the world. I think also important to keep in mind is basically where we're at and the domestic politics of the EU and then the international ones. So domestically, is it likely to be adopted? I would say yes. Is it likely to be adopted in its current form? No, because the EU is a complex machinery. You can think about it as a crossway between the UN, which is a completely non-binding organization, and the US, so a federal state. It has to strike a balance between national power and democratically elected representatives. So what happens on CBAM? The Commission presented its proposal on July 14th, and now this proposal has to make the rounds in the two main co-legislators, that is the European Parliament, which is directly elected from European citizens, and the Council. This is where diplomats from the 27 member states sit. These two bodies have to come to their own position on CBAM, independently of each other, which will probably very likely come to be different positions. And then once they do, they will have to sit down at a table in trilateral negotiations with the Commission, and then the three of them will have to find some sort of summary, some sort of minimum common denominator that will be finally the EU's position on CBAM, and that will be adopted in the end. It's a lengthy process, it's a messy process. It will not happen anytime before the end of next year, more likely to be lengthier than that. The internal politics within the EU to watch, I think, one to watch closely is Germany. You have to bear in mind, this is a proposal which the French have been wanting and pushing for years. The French government has really lobbied hard in order to get it on von der Leyen's program, von der Leyen being the president of the European Commission, and they managed to do that. Whereas export-oriented economies like Germany, but not only Germany, have been very skeptical of any kind of policy, unilateral policies, which could result in trade retaliation or make their export less competitive, both of which the EU CBAM has a high chance of. So this is for where it's at in Europe. You can follow Politico Europe coverage to know more about where it's going. And then in terms of the international aspect and politics of it, is it likely to be disputed at the WTO? There is a fair chance that the EU CBAM, and it's not me, but it's the legal people that I talked to, and Candido will maybe hopefully confirm this, but there's a fair chance that the EU CBAM, as it's designed currently, is in breach of both the national treatment principle and the most favored nation clause. What are these? These are two tenets of WTO law, which say basically you have to treat your imports the same as you treat your domestic products. And if you extend any kind of advantage to a trading partner, you have to extend the advantage to all of your trading partners. Now, it doesn't mean that the EU can't do that, but it has to justify it, it has to argue it in the WTO, and eventually WTO judges will decide whether the EU is a discriminatory measure, and if it is it justified on the grounds of environmental protection. On that, I think it will be interesting to watch. I'm pretty sure that we will see lawsuits coming in as soon as this is adopted and implemented. And even if it's litigated in the WTO, and whichever way it goes, I think it's important to bear in mind whether the EU loses and has to adapt the design of its CBAM or repeal it altogether, or whether it wins because it has designed it quite carefully, keeping the WTO requirements in mind. It will be a success or a failure, depending on what does it do in terms of environmental impacts. meaning, and I'll close there, but meaning the measure itself has a rather limited environmental impact in terms of reducing emissions per se as it's designed. I mean, of course, this is speculative, but estimates, for instance, from Cambridge University released yesterday said that in the short term, such a measure is likely to grow emissions in the EU and globally. In the long term, in the 2050 horizon, it's likely to reduce them, but very tiny amount, like 10 megatons of CO2 by 2050. But the real impact and the real success of the measure, and that's also the meter by which the EU executive is judging it, is will other countries be convinced by our stick approach, by our loaded gun approach to decarbonize their economies. And to quote Franz Timmermans, who is the executive vice president of the Commission in charge of climate, the best CBAM is the one that we do not have to use, because by the time that we get around to implementing it, other countries have adopted a carbon price, other countries are on the way to decarbonizing their economies, and we are sticking with our Paris Agreement goals.
Thank you very much. As I said, if you have a question, raise your Zoom hand or stick a note into chat and we will get to your question. I do a couple of things to keep in mind. All of the speakers have things that they've written about this issue. We will have a list of resources on our website soon after the program is over. We will have the video of the session. We'll have a transcript of the session, and we'll have resources, including Paula's stories in Politico, and Haran and Candido's, the articles that they've written about this topic. So that'll all be posted online in a little bit. I'd like to pick up with one of the last things that Paula talked about, is that will this be taken at the WTO? And Candido, I was hoping you could pick up on that a little bit.
Yeah.
If it is going to be disputed, and if it looks like it's in breach of these two pillars of WTO law right now, what's your sense about how and whether it will be disputed? And if it is, how long does that kind of play the process out before something's actually implemented?
The first thing is that the European Commission, in its proposal, has gone at great lengths to try to ensure that this proposal can win in a WTO dispute settlement case. Now, I wouldn't put my hand, saying that they will succeed, but they have taken into account WTO considerations. The EU is very unlikely to adopt any proposal or any legislation in there on CBAM if they are not convinced that more or less they can win. Because for the trading countries like Germany and the Scandinavian, etc., WTO compliance is very important. Okay, so at least in the form, okay, the European Commission more or less believes that they can defend it. Now, the European Commission, from what we know, is also convinced that they're going to be challenged, that this is going to be challenged by, actually, one of the countries that is most likely to challenge it is Russia. Russia and China. But the Commission and my preliminary assessment, and this is only preliminary, is that although you can always argue that it could violate national treatment, for example, under WTO, there are good arguments, as the proposal is now, in that the measure would be justified for the protection of the environment, and there is WTO precedents there that would support it. But it really all depends on the detail. And what's happening with this proposal and many other proposals of the Commission, what is happening is that the details are not in the proposal. The details will have to be implemented later on by the Commission through regulation. So a very, very important issue is how to calculate the embedded emissions, right? Because that's where there can be enormous discrimination. And also a very important issue is how you would establish default values for different types of countries, developing countries, for example. I've argued in one of the articles I've written is that in order for this to be WTO compliant, the proposal will have to introduce some mechanism to somehow take into account the special circumstances of developing countries. So I think there's a lot of detail to be implemented, okay? Even if this was to be adopted, the legislation is to be adopted by the end of 2022 or 2023, there will be another 3 more years where the Commission will have to negotiate and adopt the details, and it will be then when we can say that it's a WTO violation or not. But I am sure, just because of the politics, that certain countries will challenge this. And I just want to make an additional comment, because the Commission has made its own studies of who is going to be affected by this CBAM. And what is very interesting is that the countries that are, the United States, for example, has very little impacted, okay, because of these types of products. The countries that are most affected are maybe I'm forgetting some, but more or less are China. Russia is enormously affected. Ukraine, Brazil, Turkey, and I think also India. But it's basically those countries. And there are some other ones, of course, but basically the hardest, and what is also very interesting is that the hardest hit countries are the closest to the EU, because those are the ones where the transport costs are lower, okay, and therefore it makes sense to export steel, export cement, etc.
Let me pick up on one of the points that you're making and go to Haran now. If you could talk a little bit about, you know, the difference between advanced nations and developing nations and how this is perceived. I mean, what are some of the key issues regarding fairness and implementation for developing nations? And what are the potential kind of workarounds or supplementary policies that could address that?
This is a very complex issue, the fairness aspect of the mechanism. As I briefly mentioned in my presentation, there is a cost to developing countries, regardless of whether they implement the same carbon price or they don't do that and they get subject to the carbon border taxes at the border. But one could argue that if developing nations were to benefit from climate change mitigation, which we know that they will, some of the most affected countries are developing nations, wouldn't it be fair to make them pay? So that's one argument. And there is some element of truth in it. And the other argument that we commonly hear is, well, who broke it needs to fix it, right? Whoever led to the emissions to this scale should bear the burden. And there's some element of truth there as well. But I think recently it's becoming less and less clear who actually broke it. Recent research shows that land use change, not necessarily only physical emissions of carbon dioxide, but also land use change with its implications for carbon sequestration, has an important role in increasing carbon levels in climate. And that goes far back. It didn't start only with the Industrial Revolution. Recent research shows that it goes back like several hundred years before that, and in different parts of the world where population was much, much higher. So the first problem in this ethical dimension is that it is difficult to identify how far back we need to go to calculate, to have this accounting, to find who broke the climate. And then the other dimension of the problem is that there's also the future element, not only back, but also future. Some countries are projected to emit much more in the future. For example, China is one of them. So one could say that, okay, we shouldn't only look at the past emissions, but we should also look at the future emissions. But the same problem is there, how much into the future we need to look into? Like, is it 10 years, 20 years, or 50 years to calculate the relative responsibilities? The other argument is that some people can say, well, some countries are more vulnerable to climate change, or put it the other way, some countries are less vulnerable to climate change than others. So wouldn't it be fair to make the more vulnerable countries to contribute more than the less vulnerable ones? That's another complexity in this case. And then finally, the other point is that some countries are rich, some countries are poor. And we know from the economic literature that clean environment, clean climate is what economists call a luxury good, which means that people are more willing to pay for a clean environment when they are rich compared to those people who are poor, who don't want to pay for the clean environment. So when we put that together, it is politically much more difficult to implement the same carbon price in a developing country than in an advanced economy because of this public attitude. The politics of it is quite challenging. So putting all these concerns together, we could say that, okay, probably the one thing we could say, an identical carbon price everywhere in the world is probably not fair because of this for complexity. But then we immediately hit a roadblock, which is how do we differentiate carbon prices based on these four concerns? That means that each country should get a different carbon price going forward. But as Paula and Candido mentioned, it is extremely challenging to tailor this, to try to identify the carbon content of every single good. For example, when you produce a Ford truck in the United States, less than half of the parts are produced in the United States. The rest comes from many different countries and many, many different firms. In certain cases, thousands of different companies produce these parts. Trying to identify the carbon content and verify the emissions during the production is a massive challenge. And yes, that will be another complexity in addition to the fairness concerns.
Paula, I want to turn to you for a second. I want to pick up on something you wrote earlier this summer about the politics of this and the likelihood it will go through. You wrote earlier this year, making reference to Bastille Day, quote, as with the original Bastille Day at the beginning of the French Revolution, the big question is now whether everything will descend into a bloody spate of feuding where many of the nobler intentions behind the reform are lost. The biggest danger is that the proposal will be diluted beyond recognition in a series of compromises to please opponents, ranging from trade partners like the US and China through to Europe's own domestic industries. So I was hoping you could just pick up on that a second and let me know, is it still likely or possibly to be diluted beyond recognition? And have the politics of this changed in the last few months or stabilized at all or gotten more optimistic or more pessimistic?
I would say more pessimistic, but then I am a journalist. But I would say, well, what we've seen since I wrote that piece is basically a proliferation of CBAM announcements. No, we have seen the Canadian one, we have seen the American tabling legislation to implement their own CBAM. We have seen announcements also from Japan. That could be reason for hope, but is it just a comeback? Even Russia said that they want to implement a CBAM, but in their case, does it really come with commitments to climate policy? Because CBAM, as we made the point, I think strongly enough, but just to reiterate it, it's one face of the EU's climate policy, is a part of the Green Deal. It's a part that's meant to bring other countries along and avoid killing its own industry in the process. So if everybody had a CBAM because of the same motivations, I would be more optimistic. But what I actually see, not only in these announcements, but also following discussions in Geneva in the various working party at the WTO, where the BRICS, and Candido is right that the countries which are more impacted are not the United States, even though they are the ones who may make the most noise about it, but it's actually the EU's neighborhood. And they have basically short of pledged of suing the EU, should it come ahead with such a proposal. Will the EU kind of cave and give in to this pressure? Well, I think that the Commission will try to defend it and to make sure that whatever version of CBAM gets adopted in the end is not too far astray from what it proposed, at least when it comes to WTO compatibility. And I think that there is both in the Council, Candido mentioned Germany and others, but also France, and also in the Parliament, there is a recognition that this needs to be at least legal. This won't stop others from slapping tariffs on EU exports as retaliation if they so wish, but that's a different kind of ballgame, which the EU could decide to retaliate against again, and so on. So I think the chances of it being watered down, or at least highly meddled with in the negotiations process, are high. There has been also talk about climate clubs, which would be the idea of extending the CBAM not just to one bloc, so the EU, but maybe to a club of like-minded countries which are doing a lot to decarbonize, and they could have a CBAM at their external border. And this is something which is largely seen by critics as a stalling tactic to prevent the EU from implementing the CBAM. But that won't mean that there will be attempts perhaps to delay its adoption and so on. So I think there will be a lot of international pressure being put on the EU and domestic pressure in politics. Where we'll end up will largely depend on trading partners' reactions. And I think China is really the one to watch here, because it is impacted, and because of just its sheer power and its relations with the EU in terms of trade. And whether the US administration will choose to play ball, seeing that the sectors were already selected to kind of keep it out and not deal with Washington immediately when the EU proposed its CBAM.
Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about, and let me throw this one out to all three of you. I'm not sure who's best to handle this, but if you could give us a sense of, the EU proposal that's in the works and the proposals that have been put out in the US by some Democrats in Congress. Is it somebody in there in a position to kind of compare? I mean, how different is the EU proposal from some of these more preliminary US proposals?
For what I've seen, the US proposal seems more focused on retaliation than in actually having a measure, an external measure to deal with climate change. So as Paola has tried to explain, the CBAM is only part of a much bigger package on climate change mitigation measures in the EU. It's basically to somehow help the domestic industry to cope with all these climate change mitigation measures. What I've seen in the US proposals is basically requirements that say we will impose on you a CBAM if you not have equivalent climate change mitigation measures, or if you are imposing a CBAM on us, which is clearly intended to target the EU. And I think when we look at the CBAMs around the world and countries announcing CBAMs, we really need to distinguish those which are genuine carbon leakage measures. So because it's a domestic climate change mitigation legal framework, okay, and those which are have a retaliation component. I think some of the announcements made are more intended to retaliate than to deal with the problem. I just want to, yeah.
No, please carry on.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead, Paola.
I just wanted to add one aspect which the EU likes to point out about the US proposal is the US doesn't have a federal carbon price. So one element that the EU is trying to ensure the legality of its CBAM is by really trying to mirror what it subjects its own domestic industry to, by making imports pay a price which is equivalent to what EU producers of those products pay. If you do not have such a price, how can you charge imports abroad? This will fall foul of WTO national treatment principle. What the EU is trying to do, I mean, I haven't read the legal proposal, I've read reports on it, but it's to basically say to produce stuff, a ton of steel in the US, it costs more because, okay, we might not have a carbon price, but we have environmental regulation. And the Democrats are trying to quantify this extra cost of producing a ton of steel in the US vis-a-vis, say, places which have much laxer environmental regulation, and say that's our CBAM. Let's say, I'm not a lawyer again, but legally this sounds a less sound approach than what the EU has been trying to do when you look at it from a WTO perspective.
Okay. I have a question here from Patrick Flynn, who is from the UK. He asked, does CBAM present the world with a blueprint for carbon pricing convergence, or is it way off the mark? Somebody tackle that one? Haran?
Yeah, I think this is an excellent question. So based on our analysis so far, it looks like, as I mentioned, the impact. So what happens inside EU is well covered by the discussion so far. But what happens elsewhere in the world is at least two types. One is that some people will use the carrot, will see the carrot and adopt a similar price in their countries. So that will be a contagion of the carbon pricing from advanced economies to other countries. Whereas other countries, and that number will be quite reasonable or quite significant, they will not do this. They will be pushed in the other direction, and their emissions will increase. So we have the risk of, as of now, if we had only CBAM and nothing else, we would have a world almost like bipolar, clean and rich countries trading mainly among themselves, and poorer nations who are emitting more trading among themselves. So there's a risk that it can actually polarize the countries, and emissions will not necessarily be uniformly getting better in such sense. So what can we do to make sure the CBAM can work for everyone? First of all, I mentioned that the carbon price, it's not fair to have the carbon price elsewhere, everywhere in the world. And some people might think that, okay, since the differentiated carbon prices are not feasible because of the complexity of the process, how about we just apply the uniform carbon price everywhere anyway, and then compensate the developing countries for the welfare implications of that by transferring money. Our point of view in this case is that with very low institutional quality in some of these developing countries, this will not necessarily resolve the problem. That money will not necessarily trickle down to companies or people in their economies. And we believe that there are good rationale to develop supplementary policies to make sure CBAM works for everybody in the world. And as Patrick, the question in his question mentioned that there's a convergence among the paths economically and also emission-wise. And the first one is that the CBAM itself needs to be protection neutral for countries outside the Union or outside the US. And what I mean by that is that I think there is a very moral case to price the carbon, but we need to do this in a relative term. So instead of using the CBAM as a protection, it's the punishment tool to provide additional protection to our domestic producers. We should introduce that, but at the same time give perhaps reduce the protectionist measures in other areas, in the clean industries, for example. So on average, the developing countries face no additional protectionist measures at the border. That will help to change the relative price of the carbon-intensive goods and create incentives to get cleaner without any additional economic burden. The other one is technology transfers. In certain cases, our most complex problems require, or let me put it this way, our most primitive challenges that we face require the most advanced technologies. For example, if you travel to Africa, it's much easier to fly to a village than to drive there because the road infrastructure is not there. Similarly, it's much easier to get a cell phone, to talk on the cell phone, than on a landline. Again, infrastructure is different. So there is a case for a technological leapfrogging in developing countries, and the international aid mechanisms should be supplemented, specifically targeting such technological leapfrogging in developing nations. So that's the second element. And the third one is aligning the domestic policies. Many of the developing countries, they have huge fossil fuel subsidies in their economies. For example, electricity is much cheaper than it should be. And that creates false comparative advantages. So those countries become carbon havens when the subsidies are less and emissions are regulated in advanced countries, not in developing countries. Those countries become pollution havens. So what needs to be done is that, yes, CBAM can allocate resources away from dirty industries to cleaner industries in the rest of the world to a certain extent. But if we can supplement it by removing those subsidies, for example, by aligning our domestic policies, the impact of that will be much, much greater. So if we can generate these additional policies to support the CBAM, then we can make sure that it's not a punitive tool and it can lead to a contagion of mitigation efforts in the world.
Okay, so thank you very much. So we just have time for, I think, one more question, and I want to kind of possibly hear from all three of you on this briefly, but I'll start with Paula. And that's, I was hoping you could put this in the context of the COP26 climate change conference that's set to start, that's set for next month in Glasgow, Scotland. Does the existence of the EU proposal, does that make things more complicated for COP? How will it come up? Do you have a sense on that, Paula?
Yeah, I think that this COP is the one where there is a high expectations that countries will bring enhanced ambition. That means they will update their nationally determined contribution, their pledge under the Paris Agreement. And the EU has been engaging for years now, since it was canceled last year, in negotiations and diplomatic efforts around the world to ensure that that is the case. We'll see in the coming 2 weeks whether that will actually play out. But I think that it has, to some extent, poisoned the bienveillance, words escaping me, but the good-natured and good effort, goodwill, thanks, goodwill of the climate negotiators when it comes to the table and somebody's coming with a loaded gun. That's never actually helpful. So to that extent, it has had a negative impact. What it will maybe have a positive impact on is really convincing countries that they have an incentive to decarbonize. So what Harun was saying, if other countries perceive it not just as a negative, then it might have a positive impact. And just to add on what he just said, I think that you could do more, for instance, on the use of the revenues of this measure, because obviously this money is going to go somewhere, and it's going to go into the EU's budget. And I think if the EU wants to signal willingness to engage others and to ensure that developing countries leapfrog our dirty development path and get directly to the clean tech, then one thing that it could do, for instance, is to use this money for climate finance, so projects which help developing countries. And this is something that, for instance, Pascal Lamy, the former Director General of the WTO, has told me in an interview. Why don't we just use the money? This will help both in terms of arguing a defense at the WTO should it be challenged, and secondly, really show goodwill on the EU's behalf that this is not just a stick, but it's a good comprehensive measure.
Okay, and Candida, what do you think the impact of these proposals will be on COP26?
I think I agree with Paola that in a way it sort of makes the environment of the discussions a bit more difficult, but also the EU is trying to put this or present this as an encouragement or incentive for other countries to be more ambitious on climate change. But it is true that it's sort of at least for some countries, it's sort of as put them in a difficult position, and they're certainly not happy with the EU proposal.
Okay, and final thoughts from you, Haran, on that issue?
Yeah, I think I see this CBAM as a necessary step in EU to facilitate further climate action going forward. This leveling the playing field between the European producers and the exporters in other countries for the European market, I think that's crucial to build political momentum, to be able to pass legislation or introduce policies for further decarbonization in Europe. Politically, without such protection, it would be quite difficult to move ahead for the Paris Climate Agreement targets. For me, from my perspective, the problem is that how the policymakers are going to deal with the implications for the countries outside the European Union, or for the United States case, for the other countries. And I believe that we are at a very early stage, and supplementary policies will undoubtedly be necessary to make sure that this do not lead to some unwanted consequences. Even for the climate mitigation perspective, it might lead to the opposite effects rather than the desired effects. So the question is, the devil is in the detail, how the implementation will shape up going forward. We know very little at this stage. There are many details that are missing. And then what will be those supplementary policies to block the negative spillovers? And I will be watching with huge curiosity to see how that evolves.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And so I think this needs to draw to a close this briefing. Paula, Candido, and Haran, I want to thank you all very much for taking time to talk with our listeners about the carbon border adjustment mechanisms.